The Countess Mirror. In the autumn of 1854, Ravenwood Manor, deep in the forested mountains of upstate New York, was a place the townspeople avoided like the plague. The region, known for its impenetrable pine forests and fog-shrouded valleys, was home to old money families who had lived in complete isolation from the modern world for generations. Among these families, Mrs. Eleanor Ravenwood led a life of total seclusion on her estate. The manor was known for two things: the cold beauty of its mistress and the strange tendency for servants to never stay long. For months, these quick departures were attributed to Mrs. Ravenwood's harsh character. But when Reverend Jonathan Stone arrived at the estate that November, he would discover that the true reasons lay far beyond human cruelty. The horror he found in the chambers of the manor would reveal one of the most disturbing stories I have ever heard about an object that stands between two worlds. The Ravenwood family estate sprawled across nearly 500 acres of forested mountain land, with a massive stone manor house, several outbuildings, and a small chapel scattered across the grounds. When Mrs. Eleanor Ravenwood inherited the estate from her deceased husband in 1850, she had just turned 27 years old. The manor, built in the 1700s, loomed like a stone sentinel over the valley below. The massive walls of gray granite were overgrown with ivy, and the pointed towers jutted like accusing fingers into the somber New York sky. Mrs. Ravenwood, a woman of extraordinary beauty with raven-black hair and ice-blue eyes, ran the estate with an iron hand. Her pale skin seemed never to see the sun, and the townspeople whispered that she only appeared during the nighttime hours. Some even claimed she was the spitting image of her great-grandmother, who had lived 100 years before. So perfect was the resemblance to the old portraits in the manor's gallery. The first years after her widowhood were marked by routine and normalcy. Eleanor managed the estate with the help of 6 servants who were housed in the servants' quarters in the west wing of the manor. The staff consisted of a cook, 2 housemaids, a butler, a stable hand, and a groundskeeper. The atmosphere was strict, but not unbearable. Mrs. Ravenwood was distant and cold in her manner, but she paid promptly and treated her employees with the proper courtesy expected of a woman of her station. But in the spring of 1853, something fundamental began to change, something that no one could foresee, and that would forever alter the fate of all who lived in the manor. It began with the arrival of a Venetian merchant who transported rare antiquities through the American states. Signore Alessandro Monteverdi was traveling from New York City to Chicago and stopped in the nearby town to rest his exhausted horses and take on fresh supplies. The merchant was a middle-aged man with olive skin and dark, watchful eyes that constantly surveyed his surroundings, as if searching for dangers or opportunities. He spoke several languages fluently and had the polished manners of a world traveler who had seen many strange things. When Mrs. Ravenwood learned of his presence and heard of the exquisite pieces he was offering, she personally invited him to the manor, which caused quite a stir in town. The merchant brought a selection of precious items: Venetian glasswork that sparkled in the light like frozen rainbows, Flemish tapestries depicting biblical scenes of breathtaking beauty, and oriental carpets of such fine weaving that each individual thread seemed to tell a story. But one object immediately and irrevocably captured Eleanor's attention. It was a mirror of extraordinary beauty and at the same time of disturbing strangeness. The oval frame was crafted from black ebony, decorated with intricate carvings depicting strange symbols and distorted faces. The faces seemed to be suffering, their stone mouths opened in silent screams. The mirror's surface itself did not seem to be made of ordinary glass. It had an unusual depth, as if one could look into it endlessly, and the reflected light had a slightly greenish shimmer that was reminiscent of stagnant water in forgotten wells. Monteverdi initially hesitated to speak about the mirror's origin. His usually practiced sales rhetoric faltered noticeably, and a dark shadow fell across his tanned features. Only when Eleanor offered a considerable price that far exceeded his boldest expectations did he reluctantly begin to tell the story. The mirror allegedly came from the possession of a Venetian noble family, the Corvino family, which had great influence in the Serenissima during the 16th century. The family had gained their power through trade with the Orient and, as was whispered in the dark alleys of Venice, through less legitimate means. The last heiress, Contessa Lucrezia Corvino, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. One morning in 1583, her magnificent palazzo on the Grand Canal had been completely silent. The servants had found the heavy doors locked from the inside, and when they were broken open on the order of the Doge, the Contessa had vanished without a trace, as if she had dissolved into thin air. The estate was sealed by order of the Venetian authorities, and when it was finally opened decades later, they found the mirror in her private chambers, surrounded by half-burned black candles and strange symbols painted on the walls with blood. The merchant added in a quiet, almost imploring voice that every previous owner had sold the mirror after a short time, often for pittance prices, just to be rid of it. Some claimed it brought misfortune and doom to all who possessed it. Others spoke of strange visions and nightmares that plagued them as long as the mirror stood in their house. A wealthy merchant in Florence had tearfully reported that at night he heard voices from the mirror, voices that whispered his name in the darkness and called to him. A widowed noblewoman in Innsbruck swore under oath that her husband, who had died years before, stared at her from the mirror with empty, dead eyes that nevertheless seemed to be alive. But Monteverdi himself, he insisted, with an uncertain smile that did not reach his eyes, did not believe in such medieval superstition. He was a rational businessman of the New Age, of the enlightened modern era. Eleanor was fascinated, virtually obsessed with the object. The merchant's warnings seemed only to intensify her desire, as if each new story of misfortune and doom drew her even more under its spell. In her ice-blue eyes glowed a fire that unsettled Monteverdi, though he could not have explained why. An instinct, deeply rooted within him, whispered that he should not sell the mirror, but greed for gold was stronger. She paid a sum that made the experienced merchant turn pale, more than he earned in half a year, and had the mirror brought to her private chambers in the north tower of the manor that very day. The butler Frederick and the stable hand George carried the heavy piece up the winding stone stairs. Both men noticed that the mirror was unusually heavy, heavier than an object of this size should be, and that it radiated a strange coldness that could be felt even through the thick cloth coverings and made their hands go numb. They placed it according to Mrs. Ravenwood's precise instructions opposite her magnificent canopy bed, so that she could gaze at it from the moment of waking. In the first days after the mirror's arrival, nothing unusual seemed to happen. Eleanor spent long hours in her chambers, admiring the new showpiece with an intensity that took on almost religious overtones. She gazed at her reflection for hours, sometimes until the early morning hours, without moving, without even blinking. The cook, Martha, a sturdy woman with the first gray streaks in her brown hair, noted with growing concern that Mrs. Ravenwood hardly ate anymore. The elaborate meals she prepared with care and love came back nearly untouched. Mrs. Ravenwood seemed to have no more interest in earthly needs, as if she were nourishing herself from something else. The first clear sign that something was fundamentally wrong came about 2 weeks after the mirror's arrival. One of the housemaids, young Anna, a girl of barely 19 with blonde hair and fearful green eyes, had to clean Mrs. Ravenwood's chambers. When she entered, after respectful knocking, she found Eleanor standing before the mirror, completely motionless like a marble statue. Mrs. Ravenwood wore a white morning dress, and her long black hair was loose and uncombed, which was highly unusual for the normally meticulous lady. Anna greeted her respectfully, as was her duty, but Mrs. Ravenwood did not react. She stared into the mirror With an intensity that frightened the young girl to death, Anna noticed something deeply disturbing, something that made the blood freeze in her veins. Mrs. Ravenwood's reflection did not seem to be exactly synchronized with her movements. There was a tiny delay, barely perceptible to the untrained eye, but definitely present. And more than that, the reflection seemed to be smiling, a quiet, mysterious smile, while the real Mrs. Ravenwood before the mirror had a completely expressionless, almost dead, facial expression. Frightened and confused, Anna left the room as quickly as possible, her hands trembling as she closed the door behind her, and told the butler about her disturbing observation. The older man, a rational servant named Frederick who had already served the Ravenwood family for over 30 years and saw himself as a man of reason, dismissed her concerns. It must surely have been just a trick of the light or her overactive imagination. The girl was overworked and seeing ghosts where there were none. Anna should not spread such superstitious gossip. It would only cause unnecessary unrest among the already nervous staff. But Anna was not the only one who noticed something. In the following weeks, several servants reported strange occurrences in the North Tower. At night, voices were heard from Mrs. Ravenwood's chambers. Even though she was there completely alone, the voice sounded like Mrs. Ravenwood's, melodious and clear, and yet there was something else. An echo that didn't sound quite right, not quite human. A second voice that answered, also with Mrs. Ravenwood's voice, but in a strange, archaic accent, as if it came from another time. A whisper that echoed through the thick stone corridors and made the servants wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and with racing hearts. Martha noticed that Eleanor's appearance was changing dramatically. Mrs. Ravenwood had always been pale, but now her skin seemed to become translucent, almost like thin parchment through which one could see the bluish veins shimmering. Her eyes, once of vibrant ice blue and full of intelligence, seemed glassy and empty like the eyes of a porcelain doll. When one spoke to her, it took long seconds before she reacted, as if returning from a great distance, as if she first had to comprehend where she was. Her movements became increasingly mechanical and puppet-like, as if someone else were pulling the strings. The winter of 1853 brought violent snowstorms that cut off Ravenwood Manor from the outside world for weeks. Snow piled yards high blocked the roads to town, and icy wind howled around the towers like the voices of lost souls begging for entry. During this time of complete isolation, the strange events escalated dramatically. The second housemaid, Elizabeth, a normally sturdy and down-to-earth young woman who was not easily frightened, suddenly and hastily quit her service. She packed her few belongings into an old linen sack and fled the manor by night and fog, despite the dangerous weather and the deadly darkness. Before she fled into the night, she confided only to Martha, in tears, what she had seen, and made the older woman swear not to tell anyone. Elizabeth had been called to the North Tower late in the evening to bring fresh bed linens. As she approached Mrs. Ravenwood's chambers, heavy bundles of linen in her arms, she heard voices. Two voices conducting a lively conversation, almost like an argument. Both sounded identical to Mrs. Ravenwood. One voice spoke English. The other answered in a foreign language that sounded like Italian, but strangely old-fashioned. Elizabeth stood frozen before the door and listened. She knocked, and the voices fell silent abruptly, as if someone had slammed shut a heavy book. When she entered with pounding heart, she found Eleanor sitting alone before the mirror, in perfect silence. But in the mirror, Elizabeth swore with tear-streaked face and trembling voice. She had for a brief moment seen two figures, Mrs. Ravenwood and another woman, who looked exactly like her, but wore a magnificent Venetian gown from the 16th century, with a high collar and heavy brocade fabrics. The woman in the mirror had looked directly at Elizabeth and smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile that contained no warmth. Martha tried desperately to persuade Elizabeth to stay, even offered her more wages, But the girl was filled with naked panic. Her eyes wide open, she whispered in a choked voice that the mirror was cursed, and whoever was trapped inside was trying to get out to replace Mrs. Ravenwood. She said Mrs. Ravenwood was already lost. Her soul was being slowly devoured. Elizabeth disappeared into the snow-covered night, and she was never heard from again. Some in town later said she had perished in the snowstorm and frozen to death. Others claimed she had reached Albany and never spoke again of her time at Ravenwood Manor. The loss of 2 servants within a short time greatly troubled the remaining staff. Frederick tried desperately to maintain order and an appearance of normalcy, but even he could no longer suppress the growing unrest. Anna now categorically refused to go to the North Tower alone, and when she had to perform work there, she insisted that someone accompany her. The stable hand, George reported, strange shadows that could be seen at night in the windows of the North Tower. Shadows that moved and danced, even though no fire or candle burned that could have cast such shadows. In January of 1854, something happened that shook even the rational Frederick to his core and transformed his disbelief into stark terror. He was summoned by Mrs. Ravenwood to her chambers to receive instructions for managing the estate. When he entered, he saw Eleanor sitting at the writing desk, her back to the mirror. She gave him instructions for repairs and purchases in a voice that sounded mechanical and lifeless, like clockwork forming words. Frederick noticed with growing horror that something was moving in the mirror behind her. Mrs. Ravenwood's reflection was not sitting at the desk, as it should have been. Instead, it had stood up, had turned its head, and was staring directly at Frederick with an intense, penetrating gaze, even though the real Mrs. Ravenwood continued to look at her papers and spoke in a monotone voice. The reflection's eyes were not ice blue like Mrs. Ravenwood's, but completely black, without whites, without pupils, only endless black depths. Frederick left the room with trembling knees and sweat-soaked palms, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time in his 35 years as a butler, he seriously considered quitting his service and leaving the manor forever. But his deeply rooted sense of duty and genuine concern for Mrs. Ravenwood, whom he had known since her childhood, held him back. He decided to seek help from outside, against Mrs. Ravenwood's express wishes, who in recent weeks had rigorously refused all contact with the outside world. He sent a sealed letter to Reverend Jonathan Stone in town, a man he trusted. Reverend Stone was a man in his 50s, with graying hair, a man of faith and reason alike. When he received Frederick's concerned letter, which spoke of inexplicable phenomena and worry for Mrs. Ravenwood's spiritual well-being, he initially hesitated. Stories of curses and enchanted mirrors sounded like medieval superstition. But Frederick was a trustworthy man, and the urgent intensity of his letter finally convinced the Reverend to visit the manor. Reverend Stone reached the manor on a gray February morning, when thick fog lay over the land. The atmosphere of the estate was oppressive and heavy. The few remaining servants seemed frightened and exhausted. Martha led him to Frederick, who described to him in a quiet, insistent voice the events of recent months. The butler spoke of the changes in Mrs. Ravenwood, and especially of the Venetian mirror. He described the impossible things he himself had seen. Stone was skeptical, but the genuine fear in Frederick's eyes was not feigned. The Reverend decided to visit Mrs. Ravenwood personally. Frederick led him through the drafty corridors to the North Tower. With each step, the air became noticeably colder, even though no windows stood open. A quiet whisper seemed to penetrate through the stone walls, too quiet to understand words. When they reached the heavy door to Eleanor's chambers, Frederick knocked respectfully. No answer came. With growing concern, Frederick pressed the ice-cold handle and opened the door, which swung open with an ominous creak. The sight that greeted them made even the experienced Reverend gasp. The chambers were shrouded in complete darkness, all heavy curtains drawn. In the center of the room stood Mrs. Eleanor Ravenwood before the mirror, like a pale statue. She wore a white nightgown. She stood completely motionless, her palms pressed flat against the mirror's surface, as if they were frozen there. Stone stepped closer and called her name in a firm voice. Eleanor did not react, not even a twitch. When he stepped directly beside her and looked into the mirror, he recognized something terrible. In the mirror's reflection, he saw not only Eleanor's pale form, but another figure standing behind her reflection. A woman in archaic Venetian dress with black hair and a face identical to Eleanor's, but with those terrible black eyes, completely devoid of white or color. The woman in the mirror smiled at him, and her hand, visible only in the reflection, rested possessively on Eleanor's reflected shoulder. Stone immediately understood that he was confronting something far beyond his experience, something ancient and malevolent. He raised his Bible and began to recite prayers of protection and exorcism, his voice strong, despite the cold fear gripping his heart. The moment the sacred words left his lips, Eleanor's body convulsed violently. She collapsed to the floor like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The mirror's surface began to ripple like water, and a sound emerged from it, a sound that was neither human nor animal, a shriek of rage and frustration that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Frederick rushed to Eleanor's side while Stone continued his prayers, his voice rising above the terrible sounds emanating from the mirror. The surface of the mirror began to darken, the greenish shimmer intensifying until it looked like a portal to some dark abyss. The woman in Venetian dress pressed her hands against the inside of the mirror's surface, her mouth open in a silent scream, her black eyes burning with hatred. For what seemed like hours, but was only minutes, Stone battled the presence in the mirror with prayer and faith. Finally, with a sound like breaking glass, though the mirror's surface remained intact, the connection seemed to sever. The rippling stopped. The image in the mirror returned to normal, showing only Stone and Frederick kneeling beside Eleanor's unconscious form. Eleanor was carried to another room, far from the North Tower. When she finally regained consciousness 3 days later, she remembered nothing of the past months. The last thing she recalled was the merchant showing her the mirror and her decision to purchase it. Everything after that was a dark void, as if those months had been stolen from her life. Stone insisted that the mirror be removed from the manor immediately. Despite Eleanor's weak protests, for some part of her still felt drawn to it, Frederick and George wrapped the cursed object in heavy canvas and chains. They took it far from the manor, to an abandoned well deep in the forest, and threw it into the black depths. They heard it crash against the stone walls as it fell, echoing up from below, and then silence. But even cast into darkness, the mirror's influence was not entirely gone. For years afterward, the servants reported that sometimes, on certain nights when the moon was dark, they could hear something calling from the depths of the forest, a voice that sounded like Mrs. Ravenwood's voice, but wasn't quite right. And Eleanor herself, though she recovered her health and eventually her full faculties, was never quite the same. Sometimes she would stand before an ordinary mirror and her hand would rise, as if to press against the glass, before she would catch herself and turn away with a shudder. She spoke to Stone only once about what she remembered from those lost months, in a moment of weakness after waking from a nightmare. She said she remembered being aware, trapped in her own body but unable to control it, watching as something else moved her limbs and spoke with her voice. She remembered looking into the mirror and seeing her own face looking back with alien intelligence, seeing the thing that called itself Lucrezia reaching across centuries to trade places, to escape its glass prison and walk the world again in stolen flesh. The Ravenwood family eventually left the estate. Eleanor sold it to a family from Boston who knew nothing of its history. The manor changed hands many times over the following decades, and each family reported strange occurrences, voices in the night, cold spots in the North Tower, and an inexplicable unease that permeated the very stones. As for the well where the mirror was cast, local hunters learned to avoid it. They said that animals would not go near it, that birds fell silent when passing overhead, and that anyone who looked down into its depths too long would see not water and stone, but a reflection of themselves that smiled when they did not, that moved with a will of its own. The Venetian merchant, Monteverdi, left the region immediately after his transaction with Mrs. Ravenwood, and was never seen in those parts again. Some years later, a letter reached Reverend Stone from a priest in New Orleans. The letter inquired whether Stone had ever encountered a particular Venetian mirror, describing it in perfect detail. The New Orleans priest wrote that a wealthy family in his parish had acquired such a mirror, and the lady of the house had begun to exhibit disturbing changes. The priest asked for any information or guidance Stone might provide. Stone penned a detailed response, warning of the mirror's terrible nature and providing instructions for its containment or destruction. But he never received confirmation that his letter arrived, and he often wondered whether that mirror in New Orleans was another cursed piece, or whether somehow the very same mirror had found its way out of the well and back into the world, patient and malevolent, waiting for its next victim. In his final years, Reverend Stone often reflected on what he had witnessed at Ravenwood Manor. He came to believe that certain objects could become vessels for human consciousness, or perhaps attract entities that had never been human at all. The mirror, he theorized, had been used in some dark ritual by the Contessa Lucrezia Corvino centuries ago, a ritual that had gone terribly wrong, or perhaps succeeded all too well, trapping her essence within the glass but also granting her a terrible immortality and a hunger to escape. He wrote in his private journal, discovered after his death, that he believed such objects should be destroyed utterly, ground to powder and scattered, not merely hidden away. For darkness buried is not darkness vanquished, and what lies waiting in the deep places of the world is patient beyond human understanding. The story of the Ravenwood Mirror stands as a grim reminder that some objects are more than mere matter, that behind every mirror lurks not just our reflection, but perhaps something dark, something that waits longingly to be let in.